I was sitting down to think about how to succinctly talk about storytelling, and I'm realizing how significant it is to my process, and maybe even like fundamental to the way that I learned it.
Like, what are they looking at? I want to go off
Yeah.
screen now. And then, well, why aren't you looking where I want you to look? Well, because that person's pointing off the screen.
But how do we imbibe this project with a clear concept from the very beginning?
People's attention can go away. So you've got to capture it
Hmm.
very fast. And it's even getting worse now with TikTok shorts and all that. So
I would pose to you guys, do you think we're hardlining these images too soon?
I mean, I fundamentally think yes. And this is one of my biggest critiques of Enscape.
it's very expensive to do change in the digital world. And it's very hard on the artists when you have shot 99% of your film. The classic example is Sonic the Hedgehog.
Welcome to episode 3 of the Unverified podcast. I'm Laszlo Andrasi, and today we'll be talking about storytelling and design in architecture. We will be joined by Director of Visualization at Perkins & Will, Scott Schroeder, and Project Designer at the Perkins & Will Boston office, Paul Cattaneo. Welcome and enjoy.
Yeah, guys, welcome Paul, welcome Scott to the Unverified podcast. Do you guys want to give a quick introduction to yourself?
Sure. Scott, go for it.
All right, yeah, I am Scott Schroeder. I'm the Director of Visualization for the Denver studio. Do a lot of renderings, do a lot of AI stuff, a lot of stuff on Unreal. Basically, generally all things visualization.
Scott.
And I'm Paul Cattaneo. I'm based in the Boston office. I kind of work all over the place, but mostly in the Northeast. I'm a project designer and an architect, and I don't know how else to describe myself. I also teach off and on a master's and an undergrad class in architecture. So I've taught animation. I mostly teach housing. I do it all because I enjoy spreading myself thin.
Yeah, I feel like that's a common denominator, right? I mean, I
Yeah,
find a little free time and I'm like, screw it, I'll start a blog or a podcast or something.
yeah.
But,
Always got to fill it with something.
you got it, man. And then, I mean, it's what I appreciate about both you guys. I mean, I've had an opportunity to host Scott, you on the chord changes for Perkins and Will, and Paul, both host your sessions as well as co-present with you. And I really appreciate your guys' perspective on design, visualization, and how that all kind of has that common thread of we're trying to tell a story to, a particular audience, be that the clients or user groups. And I know it's a topic we're kind of all passionate about. So I think it'll be a fun kind of conversation. So do you guys want to start with, what does storytelling in design mean to you?
Yeah.
Sure. Who wants to go first?
I was sitting down to think about how to succinctly talk about storytelling, and I'm realizing how significant it is to my process, and maybe even like fundamental to the way that I learned it. And so it's sort of like it's difficult to like parse out what I do that's related to storytelling, and if there's anything I do that's not. And I think that's a key part of the design process, for me at least, is that pretty early on in my education and then in my career, I was made to acknowledge that design is for people. Design can happen in a vacuum, and intellectually, academically, it can happen in a vacuum. But ultimately, really, it should be about supporting life. And I was reflecting on this story of a project that I was working on once, and the brief was just to design this apartment. It was like an urban design studio, design an apartment for two occupants, and I made it all the way through the mid review, and there was just like it was just a haphazard slapdash approach to trying to address all these different problems, and I just was like going nowhere. And after the interview and the really bad reviews I got, I looked at it and it just clicked like, oh, I need to tell a story. I need to talk about who's in this building and not just be two inhabitants. So I created this story about a sociopath and his therapist that lived together, and they had a glass wall between them, and they were observing each other all the time in everything that they did. And there was a sort of perverse conversation about that. And I got really bad reviews again, but I loved it. I was so happy
Yeah.
to have like um, just something that created all of a sudden this cohesive kind of framework for this individual life. And I think there's a lot of value to creating something that can be universal, and but there's also some value to understanding, and a beautiful intellectual exercise to understanding the specific as well. So I think that's the kind of balance with storytelling and design, is understanding at the same time that a broad and in fact hopefully universal set of people will use what you're working on, but that also someone's going to engage with it more than others, and to understand who that is and why they might use it, and to care for them in a way. So I'm like, storytelling for me is just kind of fundamental to how I think about and go about what I'm doing.
Scott, do you want to add to that, or
Yeah, I certainly can. I approach it almost in 180 degrees difference. I am not a trained architect. I went to school for computer graphics technology, so most of my friends were on the video game path. So I was on the environmental art path. And, a lot of things that we studied was, as you're creating a film or video game, you have this very complex, visually heavy environment. How do you get the user to know where you want them to go within 5 to 10 seconds? Because if they don't know where they want to go, then they're not going to be interested. They may not continue to watch the film or play the level. And so that's where the storytelling comes. So what are we trying to tell them in this image that they have got a very short amount of time to understand what's going on? They don't understand the techniques of video game design, film design. They're coming into it as from the general public. And so using basically what the old masters did with light and contrast and color, telling that eye to go, this is what I want you to go, this is my story, and being able for them to understand it with no text at all. And so that's kind of where I approach it from, is really trying to get them to understand what I'm trying to tell them very quickly using classic art techniques, but at the same time, blend that in back to architecture and all of the time it's been taken to create that design and the idea behind that design, and also live in this reality of, it has to be somewhat close to the final realistic thing as far as, lighting and things like that, because you can't be too crazy unrealistic, because we all know people show up with renderings when the building's built and they're like, well, hey, doesn't look like this. You guys lied. There's been some pretty large examples of that recently, even in the sports world. So it's a lot of just this heavy, heavy balance of creative storytelling, realistic environment, and how do you blend the two together?
well, it's incredible kind of to me that we have the opportunity to kind of all talk, because it's so important to view storytelling from both sides, right? I mean, first of all, Paul, I feel like what we probably all discover in studio as architects is understanding that there's a narrative component to how we design, and being able to understand what is our client and kind of user groups, what is the story that they will resonate with, and how can we inform our design with that. Because really, at the end of the day, we're not going to be the ones occupying our building most of the time. It's going to be the people we're designing for. Um, and so then we're very keen on, like, I feel like as architects, we're very good at understanding that story, and good architects are really um, good at kind of crafting that story for their client. But what we could all really work on is when we're creating visualizations or any kind of um, tool for that, it's a tool to communicate the design and to communicate that story. And does it need to be photorealistic? Can it be a sketch? Can it be, a stylized rendering? I think that's all really important to understand, and it depends on the market and the client. But being really thoughtful with our graphics, I think, is just as important, because if our graphics can't communicate the story without our words, then we're missing a huge opportunity.
Absolutely. I mean, part of this is when you're communicating outwardly to say a client or to an audience, say you're proposing something at a planning board or something like that, you use visualization ultimately to hope that you can connect the user with this imagination, or like a mode of imagination in which they can see themselves occupying or enjoying or connecting with the space that you're trying to build. So I'm trying to place someone in their imagination in a space. I'm going to absolutely employ some of the techniques Scott talked about, like highlighting things, making sure that they understand and can focus on certain parts of an image or something like that. That's why I spent so much time ultimately on like placing entourage people, because I'm trying to, even just at that level, looking at all of the details in an image, I'm trying to make sure that nothing is distracting them from the ultimate point, which is I want you to see yourself here. I want you to connect with the architecture. I want you to understand that you're ultimately you're buying something that you're going to feel comfortable in, and or that you're engaged with and excited by. That all of this stuff is part of how you'll see yourself when I'm communicating to you. And I think that's a key component here. I think the other element of storytelling that's really interesting as you're talking is I'm realizing there's sort of two tracks, one being outward communication and the other being inward. And I think I hadn't separated those out until you were talking just now entirely. And I think one is about telling yourself what you're designing and self-curating the work that you're doing and trying to understand, am I coming up with a cohesive story that ultimately will be communicated? And the other is about taking the thing that you've already hopefully curated well and taking it out into the world to someone who isn't a trained designer, a trained architect, trained visualizer. So I think those individual tracks are part of like a large spectrum of how storytelling affects basic practice all the time.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Have either of you two seen the research done by Mir, the ArcViz studio, where they eye tracked 50 architects and 50 people off the street and how
No.
they view design?
Yeah,
Um,
no.
I'll I'll send you the image. Unfortunately, I cannot track down. I've been trying to track down the original author, from what I can find online to get the full white paper, but I can't actually get a hold of it. But the image that they shared was the 50 architects. There was a heat map blob on the building, nowhere else. On the public side, there was a heat map blob everywhere but the building. They were looking at the people, they were looking at the landscape, they were looking at the clouds, where the architects only looked at the building. And so that's what they know. And that's not like it's a bad thing. It's not like it's a slight against trained architects. It's they know the building, they know the design, and they will often not necessarily look at the people or look at how everything else gives that building purpose. And that's the part of the story. That's why in a lot of times, and sometimes in true like architectural visualization, you'll see that person pointing off the screen, and that totally kills your eye, because your eye's going to like, what are they looking at? I want to go off
Yeah.
Mhm.
screen now. And then, well, why aren't you looking where I want you to look? Well, because that person's pointing off the screen. And
Yeah.
where everybody else, like, they follow people's eyes first. That's what makes the old masters in art so well. They can guide your eye through their painting simply by somebody's eyes. I mean, go outside in a crowded plaza and look up. I guarantee you within 5 minutes you'll have 10 people looking up with you because they want to know what you're looking at. And
Yeah.
so by paying attention to everything but the building, that's 50% or more of the story. You've got to give that building purpose for being in that visualization. And if you focus solely on the building and not the why it's there, I think that's where the public will get kind of confused, and where we maybe get frustrated with the public. Well, why aren't you seeing what we're seeing? Well, it's different. Like I come from, again, the very visual side, film and game. So when I watch a movie full of VFX, I'm like, oh, the green screen's wrong. I can't believe they didn't key that out better. And I'm the only one in the movie theater yelling about that, where everybody else is like, whatever, this is a good movie.
Shut up,
And so,
Scott.
yeah. So it's what I know, and so I am hypercritical of visual effects and gaming. I'm an avid gamer, and so that's for me is like a lot of the trained architects. They just look at everything so differently, the way I look at film and games differently, and so it's we've got to sort of blend all those worlds together and understand that everything has a purpose, and the building realistically in the design is kind of the supporting actor in the movie, and everything else around it, that's the main key. Because how many times have we seen films that have had an amazing lead actor and then an amazing supporting actor, and that lead actor is just chewing lines and being super campy? Like it doesn't work. Everything has to come together.
Yep. Yeah. There's this amazing I don't, this image has stuck with me for years, but I remember seeing the renderings that Alison Peter Smithson did of the Economist building in London, and it's exactly what you just described. It was this like blank framework of a building, and then these super vibrantly drawn people, and the whole point of the image is that you see the life in the building, and that the building is just a framework for that life, and it's supposed to blend into the background. And they did that, and for all of the images that they did for when they were visualizing that and trying to get that built. And so it's just like one of my favorite examples of how right you are, Scott, about how I don't know, how we should engage with the story when we're trying to communicate that, that ultimately you have to look at every little detail because it all comes together as part of the communication package.
Yeah, there was a really amazing talk I was at Autodesk University a few years ago, and it was through CG Architect, and they were talking about how the public, as HGTV gets better in their visuals, the public is demanding better visuals because that's what they see and that's what they expect. Like as they start getting more and more photoreal, they're expecting that from us. And so how do we balance that? And it was a really cool talk.
Oh, I bet. Yeah. I recently was reflecting on this, like watching my I don't know who taught my son. My son's like 2.5. I don't know who taught him Mickey Mouse, because we were not intending to, like, we're trying to limit screen time, right? So someone taught him about Mickey Mouse at like daycare or something, and he comes home asking for it. It's Friday night, whatever. We can watch a little bit. I turn on something on Disney Plus, this Mickey Mouse Clubhouse, something like that.
Oh yeah,
and
I know that.
Yeah, like first season, because I don't know, I like starting from the beginning.
Yeah.
The first season is so poorly digitized. It's like it's like watching I don't even know what. It's watching these like gross 3D forms interact with this like super flat landscape, and like how is this this has good ratings. How does this have good ratings?
Is the same way, man, where it's just uncanny valley.
Yeah. So I'm fascinated, like the way that storytelling now is also evolving is really interesting. That it's not just, stories are relevant across periods. This is really amazing study on folk stories that I forget. I'm totally blanking on the name right now, but there's a study in which these academics looked at folk stories across cultures, and that there are these like themes, and you can group folk stories into these major themes that are almost always the same. There's like always a damsel in distress story, that kind of thing. So I'm really fascinated with that. That like there's, at the same time that there's stories kind of underlying everything that we do, there's also a shifting and a changing and an evolving way that we communicate those same stories over and over and over. So that's why I love talking with someone like Scott, because he's got his hand on the pulse of how the technology is changing a lot faster than I can, because I'm worried about like building separation joints for most of my day. And when I get to engage with Scott, I get to see a little bit of the future, and we get to start collaborating on like how an image could be way better than it is right now, and how I can grow as a storyteller. So
yeah, that's amazing. I the challenge of becoming ever more like photorealistic, I think is really interesting, because then what's interesting is tools like Enscape kind of democratize this kind of aspect, but it's almost to me kind of the Mickey Mouse Clubhouse or Cocomelon kind of effect where, um, yeah, I think for an untrained kind of layperson, uh, they're probably good enough, honestly, most of the time. But then if you become kind of overly specialized in visualization or, a trained architect or whatever, it becomes kind of, there's a baseline now set, and it's this kind of generic kind of stylization. And I get really interested when I see, renderings like your guys are, like you are mentioning, and visualizations that have a more stylized approach. And it's something I saw a lot in hospitality, where you can get away with, a watercolor or pencil sketch, or even just basic Photoshop on top of a white box Enscape model, and the atmosphere is just like, I'm sold, and then the client understands it a lot better. And I maybe it's because in those kind of markets, the building is a lot more of a, you're selling an experience. So like if you're in Jamaica or something, like you're in Jamaica, and the building is just facilitating that kind of experience. So I guess where I'm going with that is, where do you guys see, are there trends in visualization that you're seeing used, I guess, kind of agnostically across the industry, or is there stuff that is really interesting that's catching your eye?
Hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's an interesting trend going on, and I've worked in both facets of ArcViz. I worked for a traditional ArcViz studio before I joined ultimately Perkins and Will, and so the difference between I've got 40 hours to literally make the best possible image I can at an ArcViz studio versus working internally at architecture, where I've got 40 hours to make the best possible image and update the design
Yeah.
200 times in a week. I can't spend all that time on lighting. And so the industry is kind of split right now. You're seeing ArcViz studios and you're seeing residential architectural visualization just sort of exploding in their quality. They're exploding in their interactivity. They're really developing Unreal Engine, and then everybody else. And again, this isn't a dig on internal architecture. They've kind of flatlined, and we've been flatlined for about 25 years. We haven't knocked up that bar of quality because we're trying to sell the design, and do you need to have that beautiful rendering when, like you said, watercolor, hand sketch, photo bashing will work provided you follow proper techniques. And so there's this dichotomy going on right now of, we saw this happen when SketchUp came on. Everybody was, I was still working at the ArcViz studio, and we lost a lot of work to internal architects saying, "Oh, we'll just do it in SketchUp." And then 2 years later, they would come back to us, but like, clients aren't buying this anymore because everybody's doing SketchUp. It all looks the same. We need better images, and so then we got more work, and then we started losing work again around 2008 because these homes are selling themselves. We don't really need these really nice visualizations. And then 2008, 2009 happened, and obviously the residential market crashed, and the competition became so fierce. They came back to us. We need photoreal, 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 and that kind of died down a little bit. And then it came back, and then Enscape came on board, and photoreal kind of went down a little bit, and now it's rocketing back. They just did a survey with Architizer and Chaos Group, and of all the servants, their biggest area of R&D in next year by a margin was photoreal,
Hmm.
because the Enscape look isn't cutting it anymore. Everybody's like, well, that's Enscape. And so it's this constant pendulum swinging in the visualization industry of good enough, that's fine by now, but then as market tightens and competition gets a lot harder, that photoreal comes in and that storytelling comes in, and we're kind of seeing the pendulum swing back to that photoreal storytelling right now. And so I think that's sort of the biggest thing that I've been seeing right now, is that Enscape look is great for initial design, but once it starts getting out into the public,
Mhm.
it's not good enough unless you're customizing that Enscape look. Like, you're changing the sky. Enscape has the exact same sky every time if you don't. And so
Right.
that's a huge teller of, oh yeah, that's Enscape. And so you got to be careful about things like that.
Well, I think this is really interesting because it almost, to me, as like a designer and wannabe storyteller, it almost doesn't matter the tool. Like it's the intentionality
Mhm.
of what you're trying to say. And Enscape, yes, if you just click render and send it in an email, you've you've done something, but just hopping into Photoshop and like using those channels to just kind of bring it up a little bit. Like even just 15 minutes on an image can do a ton. Um, and all that is just kind of like craft, and I think that's really important. But having just an intentionality of your images is so, like, if you have a bad story, like a bad view angle, and the entourage is pointing all over the place or whatever, like you were saying, Scott, like that is, you could Photoshop the crap out of that, and it's not going to do much. It's
No.
just not. It's not telling the story you want. And I guess I'm wondering, collaboration, like who, as a designer and visualizer, I feel like you guys should be collaborating in the very beginning, and it's important to have that kind of expertise. Um, have you guys had successful examples of those kind of interactions?
So in my past life, I worked a lot more in memorials and sculpture and art installation, that kind of stuff. That's sort of my history. And the collaborations on those, the most successful I worked on was actually with a curator. So basically a, a consultant for storytelling, and that curator would talk with me and the client, and we would work together to sort of craft a story. And the client had the reason that they were paying this curator was to sort of make this kind of become relevant to that client and their industry. And my engagement with it was more as like an urban researcher and someone who was doing these visualizations to try and like get that storytelling to become relevant also architecturally. So we both were coming at it with our own like story to tell, and an ultimate goal for the storytelling, and the curator had to come together to tie everything together. And that was this incredible collaboration that went on for several years. 10 this was like 10 years ago now, but that was like probably my most memorable. And I would say the nature of that was very different than a lot of the work that we do. So like here in Perkins and Will, we're not doing a lot of that kind of urban research with this was for actually for a car company, um, and we're not really doing a ton of that. So I think here's what we're doing in Boston. We're doing something right now called that we're oscillating between calling pinups and charrettes. But this is basically something where once a week the office comes together. Whoever can join, no matter who they are, can come together and sketch together on a particular project. And we highlight a particular project. We're looking at the specific parts of it that we want to talk about. The designers who are in charge present it for maybe 15 minutes, and then the rest of us noodle for like 45 minutes and start sketching, and there's trace flying, and we're talking about different things, and you're getting people from all different ranges of experience coming into those meetings with a ton of different perspectives. And I think that's been like some of the most electrifying collaboration at this point is is saying, like, as we're telling the story, and this is a little bit different than like just visualization as storytelling. This is like at its core, how do we implant a DNA of a clear and concise message as some kind of concept? We call it conceptual clarity in the living design, you know, ecosphere at Perkins and Will. But how do we imbibe this project with a clear concept from the very beginning, or wherever the project is when we review it, and how do we reinforce it when we come back to the project and we're going through peer reviews and we're getting other people to look at the work? Is that story remaining pure? I think that kind of like ongoing collaboration is what helps keep the project on track towards telling that story from bottom up. And then as you understand that and you tap into that story, when you get to the place where you're starting to communicate using visual means, hopefully that story becomes readily apparent or is easier to tap into because that's like part of the DNA of what you're looking at.
Yeah, collaboration, in that storytelling, it's really important for a lot of our work. A lot of the successful examples I have draw from when I was at the ArcViz studio, because we were really telling stories for the residential side. You're trying to convince people, hey, you got to spend a lot of money here on this condo or this vacation home in Hawaii. And so that naturally led itself to storytelling and experiential visualization. Um, and some of that doesn't always happen here within Perkins and Will, although, recently we had a really good collaboration with one of our arena projects. It was going up for a bond vote for the third time. It had failed twice before. And we had looked at what they were presenting, and what they were presenting was a very technical, here's what it's going to cost you in taxes, here's, and they only showed one configuration of the bowl, and the public was like, yeah, basketball, great. But they didn't understand we could do 45 other events there. And so we kind of came together and like, okay, for this bond vote, we're going to experience the arena. And so we showed basketball, ice, concert, hockey, monster truck, TED Talks, all of that to remind them that you can configure this arena in a multiple different ways and experience the arena sort of coming in, going through, seeing all the different events, and sort of then exiting out. And the whole presentation was non-technical. There was no floor plans, no numbers, no nothing. It was all the experience of the public, and it passed. It passed the bond vote. And so, understanding like the public cares a lot about, okay, my taxes might be going up, but if you show them why that 1% or that 1 cent tax increase is going up, because you can host just about anything in this arena now, that that works so much better than just saying, well, here's an image of basketball, but in your mind, imagine Disney on Ice and TED Talks and things like that. And the public, some can, some can't. So we had to show them, like, this is what we're going to do. And I think that resonated with that vote. And because we were nervous it wasn't going to pass. It was a non-major election cycle. It was in between the midterms and the presidential. So was turnout going to be there? And typically the people that sometimes vote in those non-major years, they're not one to really like taxes going up. And so we had to convince them that 0.75 cents you're going to feel to pay for this arena, this is what it's going to do. And I think by experiencing it more than just looking at floor plans, really put that message in of what we wanted to do. And it had to be quick. We try to limit all of our animations to 2 minutes and 30 seconds because that's the Hollywood trailer length. After that, people's attention can go away. So you've got to capture it very fast. And it's even getting worse now with TikTok shorts and all that. So you're really having to hammer in this massive project scale, massive amount of information in 30 seconds or less. Like, you've got to nail it fast.
Right. You don't have to show everything, right? You don't
Right.
have to show every angle. A recent example on my end is designers, we get an itch like once a year to enter a competition or do something extra, right? And so last year, a few of my colleagues in Chicago and I entered an outside competition. I think it was a Terra Viva for this outdoor museum in Turkey. And what was really cool is we tried to grab as many people from different disciplines as we could. So we had interiors, we had landscape, we had urban design, and branded environments. And in particular, branded environments, our colleague from there, Emily, what she was able to bring to the table was this kind of storytelling narrative aspect from just like the very beginning of a project where, all the interior designers, urban designers, architects were busy designing the actual built form. She was able to bring the table of like the actual user experience, and that was a really important kind of aspect that I think I'm going to keep in mind a lot sooner in projects and try to understand what the story is we're trying to tell. So I thought that was really valuable, and it highlighted to me having a variety of perspectives on throughout a project. And I think there's a lot of benefit of, just like you were saying, your little charrettes, Paul, where it could just be a quick kind of peer review or quick, sketch session where is the narrative we're trying to sell being communicated across, people in my studio? And are they picking up on that, or can they like show me something I wasn't expecting?
Mm,
Another person who's probably pretty good to talk to is just non-designers, like you were saying, Scott, about where are people even looking in the image? Family or friends that aren't architects are probably the best kind of people to show these images to, because they're going to notice things every time that we overlooked. For example, like renderings I've done in the past where for a stadium project we had like a glass of beer on a table or something, and it's not even in the foreground or background, it's just somewhere out there, and they're like, oh, we can't show alcohol in this image, and it's like, how are you even picking up on that?
Mm-hmm.
Like, there's this huge stadium in front of you. Why? how, but those little details matter.
yeah,
Yeah.
um
I think this is like, I haven't heard this quote in a while, and I forget who said it, but I used to hear this constantly when I was, back in school. Is like the medium is the message, and I think that's like from my intro to psych class. The medium is the message, which I like. Yeah, I get it. That and I totally believe that. And this is where I would actually kind of push back a little bit. Something um, we were talking a little bit about, like the story being present, even despite the aesthetic being different or the language being different. I think actually a part of this, and that glass of beer story sort of reminds me of this, is that at the same time that we're trying to communicate some of these very similar stories, or these stories that have a kind of internal resonance, there is a shifting language that resonates with people in a different way throughout cultural history, and the evolving way that we as humans interact with media in general. Social media's effect on things changes. It globalizes things. Pinterest changes things. We've seen that in our own studio. That people are looking to Pinterest for stuff, which just narrows the creative well from which you can draw. Not to knock Pinterest, but I think AI kind of has this problem too. You're drawing from very limited data sets that are enormous at this, but at the same time limited by the mind of whoever created the data set. And I think we as designers have to understand those things as language. We have to be linguists at the same time that we're storytellers, and understand those individual things, like a pint of beer can communicate something far larger to someone who is tuned into that, who is a client that is trying to represent a student population, say, and doesn't want their students seeing beer in an image. Understanding those things, or for example, if when you propose a building and you put a kind of watercolor aesthetic on it, there is actually a sort of difference in the way that you perceive how settled the design is, and that sort of I haven't seen that change in the last you know whatever 15 years I've been practicing. That still remains as a kind of feature of how people perceive design proposals, that like the shakier the pen, the less settled the design is still there. And we're still
mhm.
sketching, we're still creating this kind of stuff. So I think this is this really interesting and very complex web of how media is progressing and changing throughout time and history, how we as architects and designers are responding to it, and then how like storytelling sort of weaves that all together. It's a lot. And
Yeah.
I don't know, I have a lot of thoughts on this, and not a lot of like a lot of it is
Well,
questions.
I think that's really good. And I mean, one thing I would pose to you guys, do you think we're hardlining these images too soon?
I mean, I fundamentally think yes. And this is one of my biggest critiques of Enscape, is that we are always looking at stuff with a kind of hard line. um, Often even having the edge setting on is actually adding a hard line to something that shouldn't be seen with that much detail too quickly. I see people zooming in on their screen far more than they're zooming out and seeing the big picture, and that to me is like, I don't know, maybe it's just me finally hitting the point where I'm becoming a dinosaur, where I want to understand the concept before I get into the details of something. And if I'm looking at Enscape while I'm like working, I can't really understand the major narrative or the larger picture that is tying everything together. The same way, like when you're painting, I was trained a little bit with fine arts. You have to zoom in, but you also have to zoom out. Particularly in life drawing, you have to understand the structure of what you're drawing before you can really start detailing. And that's, I mean, that to me is like a key component of storytelling.
Yeah, and Enscape for sure. I agree. I think we are hardlining too early, because in the especially in the real time world, once you show somebody an image, they're going to react, and you have to control that reaction. And in that real time world where they can spin around to something that's not designed yet, and they're going to flip out about that, now you're going to be derailed. You know, Worrying about that. I have a phenomenal example of a project of ours where the client really was having a hard time with the building because the flower pots weren't right because we were in Enscape. And like we're in pre-design here. The flower pots don't matter, but it mattered to them. And so we
Mm.
had to take the time to put the flower pots in, the right flower pots, mind you, with the right plantings for them to say, yeah, we like this building. And we did not control that reaction very well. And a lot of that came from as we were showing pretty well refined Enscape really early on. And it was really tricky to them. And so, it's controlling that reaction. It's starting small, starting sketchy. And, we've seen it a lot in some of our project proposals where we'll have the best design or best renderings going into the project interview, and we may not always win because sometimes that scares the client. Like, oh my God, but it's already done. We're not going to have any input on this. Where somebody does a hand sketch or no design, and they win. We won a project here with the North Carolina studio specifically because we didn't have any renderings and everybody else did, and the client loved it. They're like, it wasn't about design at this point. It was about how are you going to
Mm.
approach this space? And you were the only ones who didn't show up with really well completed renderings. And so that was a huge win for us.
That's big. Yeah. I think really like knowing who you're talking to.
Yeah.
And I will say some of our biggest and most successful design directors in this office, these offices that we work for are fantastic at this. When you talk to them, they have a sensitivity. Um, I'm thinking specifically of people like Rob Goodwin or um, who else? Well, yeah, you know who I mean.
Mhm.
These people have a sensitivity to their clients. They have a sensitivity because they have worked with so many people. They understand that relationship, and they're honing that. And I think storytelling should be a responsibility of everyone on a team. Every person as a part of a project is just like know who you're talking to, know what they care about, and know what you're crafting. And this to me is like also, sorry, I feel like I'm soapboxing, but this to me is
Why you're
also
on
like
here.
pre- presenting from Miro is like becoming a major red flag for me. Presenting from Miro means you are live curating for your
That was
client.
kind of, yeah.
Yeah, something that they can go anywhere. They can just, if you give them the link, they can just start zooming off and looking at stuff that you can't control. And not that you want to control your client, but you want to tell a story in the way that's digestible. And I mean, like some really sophisticated clients can engage with a story and also, connect with things along the way. But a lot of people have no idea what we do. And in a lot of ways, it's very inaccessible and navel gazing, and architecture is critiqued for that all the time. So anytime we have an opportunity to make an inroad to culture, an inroad to someone, and communicate clearly and succinctly, we should take it, and we should think very, very intensely about how we communicate those things before we do it. And going out with uh, a collaboration tool as a presentation tool is like know your tools too. Know who you're talking to and know your tools. That's like a big thing for me at this point. Is like, you know, this is why we still use PowerPoint because it's linear, and people
Right.
think, and when they're thinking about stories, they don't think entirely. Often when they're trying to understand something, they have to think linearly. And maybe that's going to change. I don't know. Maybe COVID changed stuff for the younger generations. But still, when I was teaching some of these Gen Z emerging designers, they're like they still think like that. They need to be told a story. They need to understand the background and why they're doing what they're doing. And clients are the same. They need to understand, how did we get here? How are you responding to the prompt that I gave you and the problem that I have? And then how are we going to fix it? That's a story. So don't tell it with like a network of Pinterest.
Yeah, and you mentioned something, Paul, about the hand drawing and the painting, and there's this really great quote from Phil Tippett, who is a old school phenomenal VFX supervisor, and he was talking about the difference between when they were on RoboCop and today, and how storytelling decision making was better honed on the old RoboCops because everything was physical. There was a physical cost to the change where the matte painting in the background, if they decide to change it, there's a hard cost in canvas and paint and time, to where now that we've gone all digital, those hard costs are completely hidden. They're still there, but you're not having to go out and buy more paint and buy more canvas because you said, I want that building to be 27 stories instead of 25. And you're just redoing it all in a digital world. And so it's a lot easier. And it becomes this game of, rather than how do we make this shot better, everyone looks at the shot and goes, what's wrong with the shot? And when you play what's wrong with the shot, you are not encouraging art. You are encouraging that idea that everything is subjective, everything is wrong, and the people working on it all of a sudden switch to that mindset of saying, I want to make this better, to, I don't care what you tell me. Flamingos in the front yard, just get me off this project. I don't want to be on this anymore. This is the 300th change you've made me make. And that's been the biggest thing about the digital world is there's no hard cost. There's no exposed hard cost associated with it. And
Oh
so
yeah.
it's not, you don't want to think about what's wrong with the shot. You always want to think about how do you make it better. And when you do that, you encourage art.
This is where, man, I had a funny idea and I pitched it to Nick Cameron just as a joke, but pretty serious, like personally, where it would basically we would charge our team's credits, like Enscape credits when they hit render. So like every time it's just like making a print or something. So
Yeah.
well, like
Yeah.
first of all, you're not charging for your rendering, so you're pumping out dozens and dozens of renderings and showing them Pinterest style to your clients and not having a narrative. And then it got me thinking. I was walking around our office and beautiful imagery, but the ones that always stuck out to me were when the project architect or designer drew a sketch and like did leaders and stuff, and it was usually on top of a Enscape image, but there was like an intentionality to this. Like they had to curate that perspective and take the time to add those kind of details to it. And I always really appreciated seeing those kind of things just because it was something kind of new. And well, it's something old but that's new again, that I very much appreciated.
Yeah. I mean, think about how a movie first starts, a Pixar film. Are they modeling the character? No, it's hand sketch storyboards all
Yeah.
the time. It's where it starts because that change is very simple to take an eraser to it. It's very expensive to do change in the digital world, and it's very hard on the artists when you have shot 99% of your film. The classic example is Sonic the Hedgehog.
Yeah.
When that trailer released and they decided to go in a different direction from what everybody knew Sonic was, it blew up obviously on the internet. And those poor VFX artists, I knew a couple of them, and the crunch time that they had to do to go reshoot that entire film to have a normal Sonic, when all of the artists were saying this isn't going to go well. People they want Sonic. It's like Mario. You want Mario because that's
Yeah.
what we know as kids, as our core memories. And so to change that is dangerous in a way that it could have worked, but most people are like, yeah, it's probably not going to work. And
Yeah.
so it's
Yeah.
starting that sketch. They should have released the sketch of the new Sonic first, let the internet burn it down, and then say, okay, now we're going to go back.
This is like, I don't know. I was talking to our one of our interns the other day who was asking me how should I do this, and I immediately did something that my boss does to me all the time, which is, can you show me a couple options? And I think the core of that was, do the thing that is going to show me how and help me visualize how this is all going to work, and show me a couple different ways, and then we'll make the decision together. Sketch it basically. And I like, this to me is also, it's not just about saving time and saving resources, but really when it comes down to it, the creative process requires a kind of like a flow state, if you want to get into psychology, but a flow state that allows you to very quickly translate an idea onto a medium of some kind. And just in the psychology of this, like the more barriers you put between your ideas and the paper that they go onto, whether it's like the difficulty of doing things in Revit and getting those things like out into the world when they're just in your head, and why certain tools are better for design and some are better for documentation. Like, I think always evaluating the tools that you're using is so important to storytelling. So if it needs to be done with a sketch, then it needs to be done with a sketch. Don't overthink that. Just do it. Just
Yeah.
start sketching.
You could always go back and forth, right? It
Yeah.
doesn't, you don't ever have to stop sketching. And if you want to, yeah, you could always hardline it, I guess, in Rhino or Revit, and then see how it's kind of working out when you kind of be more precise, and then go back to sketching. Um,
Yeah. Yeah. I
yeah.
had a great
Well,
teacher that taught me that you never really understand something until you've drawn it. And I think that was absolutely right. Drawing should always be an investigative act and should never be something, drawing by hand at least, should never be something that is saying like, this is how this should look. I think it really, at this point with the digital world, drawing is really about investigating the world around you and investigating how you want to intersect that with the designs in your head and
yeah,
and how you want to tell a story. So
that was separated even back in old school, right? There was
yeah,
drawing and drafting, and
yeah.
um, yeah, understanding you could do both in analog and digitally is important. Well, being mindful of our time, do you guys have any closing statements? Kind of something to leave the viewers off with?
Hmm.
I just could talk about this forever. I think
Yeah.
I just I care about this a lot, and I think it's because anything that is going to bring design to life is important to me, and I think it's becoming more important the more I see how saturated we are as a culture with different narratives and media constantly and shifting and changing things. Is to try and understand, at least for me, try and understand what's going to tie us and make more permanence and more value and more depth to a project when media is constantly changing and the way that we perceive the world is constantly changing. I think like understanding that is becoming core to the way that I view the world. And I think the more mature I am in my practice, the more craft in storytelling, craft in the construction of a story is becoming kind of fundamental to how I see architecture. It's just becoming the core of it. So I think people should really take this stuff, take it seriously.
Yeah,
Wonderful.
I think, my big message is in the digital world, it's very easy to get detailed and don't look down on the sketching, the block and the massing, because if it works in the blocking, now I understand that sometimes things don't always translate from blocking to final design, but you will have a much better result if you get it right in the block form versus just starting off with the exact, hyper realistic designed, building form. Again, I watch a lot of making ofs for film and games, and they always start with the blockouts. Like for Encanto, like the main dance sequence, the original thing was filmed with just colored blocks representing each family member bouncing down the road. And that's how they did it. And they framed that. And if you actually watch it, when they come together, they form an M for Madrigal, the family. If you trace their heads, it makes an M. And that's just one of those little hidden details that they did in block form. And so if
Huh.
it worked in the block form, when they finally got the characters in, those character artists already knew where to put them. And they weren't trying to guess with a highly detailed character and animators and all that. They had already got it in that block form. They got it in the storyboard. They got it in the sketches. And so as architects, we always want to go super detailed early on because that's what we know. But it's like work on that massing, work on that block out, and get that block out done. And it's okay that your building is spheres and cubes and cylinders because that will translate so much better to your final design than starting off actually making the whole thing.
Mhm.
Thank you for joining episode 3 of the Unverified podcast. Uh, please like, share, and subscribe if you enjoyed the content, as well as leave a comment or contact me directly if you have any ideas for future episodes. Thank you.
This is like, I haven't heard this quote in a while, and I forget who said it, but I used to hear this constantly when I was back in school, is like the medium is the message. And I think that's like from my intro to psych class, the medium is the message.